I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for joining me. I'm Julie Ballou, and this is Rape the Podcast. I'm going to take y'all back to the Me Too rally in Springfield, where I started working on Rape the Podcast. A story told at the rally by Greene County Clerk Shane Scholler really struck me.
I want to make sure everyone knows before I begin, we'll be talking about a story this afternoon that could bring back painful memories for some of the audience. But I'm telling it because it is important and needs to be heard. On September 1st, 1834, here in Greene County, Millie Sawyers, a former slave from Ohio who had been freed for 15 years, filed a complaint in the Greene County Circuit Court against William Ivey. She filed the suit to hold him accountable for the assault, battery, and false imprisonment he had committed against her. In her filing, Millie said she was a free woman of color and was deprived of liberty by Ivey. Millie stated in her filing that she'd been pulled and dragged down the road and struck a great many blows by Ivey. She wanted her freedom restored and asked for $500 in damages. As you can imagine, Millie had two fears when she filed her suit. She feared being taken out of the county and to be sold back into slavery. Judge Charles Allen granted her wish in order to investigate her right to freedom and placed Millie in the custody of the county sheriff to ensure that she was not kidnapped and sold while awaiting trial. Ivey was ordered to stay away from her, and little Barry Hendrick was appointed by the court to be her attorney. Though a slave owner himself, Hendrick appeared and intended to do his job and represent Millie in court. He was subsequently harassed and the door to his house broken down by Ivey and his accomplice, James Comer. Almost a year later, Millie won her freedom by default when Ivey failed to appear before the court date set. Judge Allen ordered that Millie was free and discharged of and from the service of William Ivey. Sadly, her victory was short-lived. Less than a year later, in August, Junius T. Campbell, James A. McCarroll, and Lucius Roundtree broke into the home of John Edwards, where Millie was staying, drug her out of the house, and assaulted her. Charges were filed soon after, and yet less than 1 year later, on April 1st, 1837, all the defendants had pled not guilty, and all the charges had been dropped. Millie, for the time, disappeared from history, while her persecutors and others like them went on to be remembered as prominent members of the society and even have streets named after them. Millie was deprived of her basic human dignity. People attempted to silence and intimidate her and deprive her of justice. Perhaps some of you here today and others that identify with the Me Too movement have stories similar to Millie's. Those stories need to be heard and remembered. Stories are powerful in many ways. When a person has been wronged, regardless of the wrong, the stories we remember and tell prevent the perpetrator from escaping into the shadows of history, as Millie's assailants almost did. Evil and injustice thrive when we choose to be silent. Those who choose to be evil things are counting on our silence when they commit acts of victimization and prey on others. For those here today that have a Me Too story, your experience matters. We must resist the temptation to sanitize our histories by forgetting uncomfortable realities. The power of Me Too is helping those who have felt afraid to share what happened to them and know they're going to be heard and cared for rather than fear they would be ignored and not believed. What you may not realize is that the office of county clerk that I serve in has a very important role in preserving and remembering stories. The story I shared earlier about Millie Sawyer has been there all along in the county archives that are maintained by the office. For hundreds of years, it has been buried, just waiting to be rediscovered and retold. Connie Yen, who serves as the supervisor of archives, found Millie's story as she was working one day, and thanks to that good work, her story has been told to countless others in numerous ways. As I think of the hundreds of thousands of names we have stored within the documents we continue to preserve for future generations, I know there are countless other stories that need to be heard, and that we can all learn and grow from them. Sadly, many of those stories will never be heard. For those here today who were harassed or mistreated in other ways, we need your truth, and we need to be told now more than ever. To think that it took over 185 years for Millie's story to be heard is not okay. I'm compelled by my Christian faith to know we are created as His image. We must see that image in others and do better to seek justice and wholeness. Together we have an opportunity to confront the evils of our day, and let us show those who think they can prey on the vulnerable that they will be held accountable for their actions, unlike William Ivey, Junius T. Campbell, James A. McCarroll, and Lucius Roundtree for what they did to Millie. Her story mattered then, just as it does now. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Millie Sawyer's story was even told on stage at the Landers Theater in Springfield by a super talented band of actors, written and directed by a local high school teacher. I'm so glad I got to see that performance before COVID. I wanted to learn more about this story, so I asked Archivist Connie Yen and Clerk Shane Schuller to meet for a coffee. Again, this was before COVID.
William Ivey didn't show up to court, so Millie won her freedom by default. She was declared a free woman.
William Ivey, what was his story?
We don't know much about him. He was one of the early settlers, obviously, and then after that, he disappeared. Mm-hmm. Like I said, he didn't show up to court, and as far as I know, he didn't ever live here again.
So would this case be then used as like case law to compare to other cases that came afterwards?
Well, there are a lot of similar cases, at least in Missouri and St. Louis. They have hundreds of these. I read about 40% of them were successful, but then this was prior to Dred Scott. Dred Scott came along a few years later in Missouri, same kind of case, and he lost. Mm-hmm. That set precedent.
Right.
But Millie really didn't.
How does this story affect you guys? Why was this important for you, Shane, to talk about during the Me Too rally?
Well, I think when Connie came upon this story in terms of the record preservations and going through the records we have as a county, I think it was important for people to understand when you think about the history of our county, where we were, where we've come from, and that almost, had it not been for the good work of county, that this story would not have been known. And I think when you go back and you look at injustices in our society, whether it's at the national, state, or the community level like this story, which really, I think it affects all levels in terms of the story, you can learn from those, because it's important that we not continue to sweep these things, as I say, almost out of sight so that no one knows about them. I think that when we look at the injustice that happened to Millie Sawyer, and also there was another lady that was involved at the time as well, the same night, Callie Easter. And the same night that Millie was beaten and dragged out of her home, Callie Easter, another woman of color, was basically, her home was raided, and they took her in order to take her freedom away, and she was beaten as well. And her story is not nearly as well known. Unfortunately, we have the preservation of what happened to Millie. We don't have near as much information about Callie. But I take that look at today when someone is raped and their rights are taken away from them in that moment, even though their story was a story of freedom for their personal freedom, I see a lot of similarities in those, and that when you're able to tell those stories, and especially as you're teaching your children, they need to understand that, we have to respect one another, and that you don't get the right to have the opportunity to do as you think or please with somebody else, that you have to respect them and what they tell you. And I think that's been one of the great benefits of the Me Too story. When I look back to slavery, had people not continued to speak up on behalf of the slaves to say this was wrong, where would we be today? And those are the reasons I think those stories have to continue to be told.
I can't imagine how much courage it must have taken both of those women to face what had happened to them in the open court of law, to discuss that amongst people. Because Springfield has got a treacherous history of racism and minorities have always had a hard time here and continue to have a hard time here. So,
They do. And unfortunately, that reputation is well known. I remember when I was in college, a friend of mine went to play football up in Northwest Missouri State. And when he found out that he was from Taney County, is where I grew up in Branson, on the football team, his teammate who was black said to him, "I never want to go down to Southwest Missouri," because he knew the story of the lynching, right here in Park Central Square. And that unfortunately me, as a kid in college, I wasn't aware of that history until that time. But that's a very unfortunate mark that we have in Southwest Missouri, that we need to continue to take steps to make sure people know that that's not who we are today, and that we don't want to be that community. We want to welcome everyone, regardless of their color, to our community.
I just mixed down an episode of Frances Cadora's podcast, Look at Us Now. That's a show that I edit. Fran was one of my very first interviews for this project. You heard her brave story in episode 2. I would invite you to listen to her podcast, Look at Us Now, episode 9, as she talks to Sarah, with an H, Kennedy, a life coach who specializes in helping families going through identity struggles. She talks about introducing yourself along with the pronouns you'd like people to use when referring to you. I've seen a lot of people doing this lately, and it kind of confused me when people would say, "Hey, my name is Julia Blue, and I use the pronouns she and her." I just kind of figured people assumed that about me. But I guess that's the whole point, is we can't assume. I was confused because I'm a cisgendered white girl who hasn't had to struggle with what people called me. I take that back. I guess there have been a few times in my life I had a short haircut, or I was going through chemo and some people might have thought I was a guy. And you know what? It did piss me off. Just because I had short hair or bald, I was not my obvious gender. Have you seen the size of my... Never mind. So found out why introducing your pronouns is important. I'm putting a link to the Look at Us Now episode up at rapethepodcast.com. Help change our culture to stop misgendering people. So learn that and absorb these statistics from a 2015 U.S. transgender survey. Nearly half, 46% of respondents were verbally harassed in the past year because of being transgender. Nearly 1 in 10, 9% of the respondents were physically attacked in the past year because of being transgender. Nearly half, 47% of respondents were sexually assaulted at some point in their lifetime, and 1 in 10% were sexually assaulted in the past year. In communities of color, these numbers are higher. 53% of Black respondents were sexually assaulted in their lifetime, and 13% were sexually assaulted in the last year. 72% of respondents who have done sex work, 65% of respondents who have experienced homelessness, and 61% of respondents with disabilities reported being sexually assaulted in their lifetime. More than half, 54%, experienced some form of intimate partner violence, including acts involving coercive control and physical harm. Nationwide studies of sexual assault indicate that racial minorities, transgender people, and people with disabilities are targets of sexual violence at greater rates than the general population. Let me introduce you to another podcast I've got a link to at rapethepodcast.com. It's been through some name changes, but the story of this 72-year-old woman of color is 100% something you should listen to. You're never too old to tell your story.
I don't even believe you're 72 years old. I don't even believe it.
I'm old. I'm getting to that age.
Yeah, I'm surprised because I never thought I would live this long, so I'm good. So, okay.
I wonder if that's common among victims and that we just...
I think it is for a lot of us.
I want to thank you so much for putting your story out there on the internet, on podcasts. Started out with a different name and you changed the name. Can you talk about what was going on there?
So I think I started out with just the understanding betrayal. Then I realized what I was talking about. Okay, so I had to think, And I had to think about my definition of betrayal may have been different than someone else's. So that's why I added the name rape, childhood sexual violence, and incest. And once I made that change, it turned everything around. And I have to tell you, it's taken at least 8 podcasts of putting things out consistently before I began to build an audience. And one of the things that I found was I'm doing things by series. So if you look at our website, out of our podcast directory, we have a whole series on the infrastructure of childhood sexual violence. And I build up to be able to build those cases to do series based on the first few episodes. These are the things that we need to look at based on these. And so by the time that I introduced the infrastructure series of episodes, people already had a format of what I was talking about.
Yeah.
So that made a big difference.
You're really going depth to a lot of topics. There could be a million podcasts about this topic because there's so many different versions of the trauma itself.
So you looked at the infrastructure. One of the things that I wanted to make sure that people understood is what I call there's always a predator in large. It doesn't matter who the asshole is. It doesn't matter if it's Bob Figure or that it's a Jeffrey Epstein or R. Kelly. There's always some guy and he has status. And his status protects him. It may be because he has more money than anybody else in the family, but he is the dominant character. But the one that bothers me the most is the second and third level. So it's always the mother figure or maternal figure or some woman that supported him because her identity is totally wrapped up in this guy. If you think about what you're living on your podcast, if you look at what they were discussing, this falls within the parameter of what they were discussing. Because if you remember, there was the young woman who said that her sister ended up marrying the guy who raped her, and the family has, excluded her. It comes down to that. So you have the predator, you have whoever the maternal figure is, married, she knows what the hell's going on, she chooses not to look at it. Her identity is being the missus, the proud missus. And there's the siblings and other family members who are aware of what's going on. They pretend they don't know what the hell's going on, but they do. And then by the time you get to the fourth layer, there's us. Those of us who have been victimized. The worst part about it, we're interchangeable. It could be your sister, it could be the brother, whoever they bring in to, as a child to abuse, it doesn't even matter what our names are. You could just be interchanged over generations. And that is the part that's scary to me. And then there's the ones who are like the siblings and then the future generations. Because siblings, the younger sibling may know what's going on. They're too afraid of what's going to end up happening, so they don't protect you. And besides that, you're just a kid. You don't have any power. All about the freaking ass power. And kids, we ain't got any. This is not about the individual who's being victimized. It's about future generations in our communities. Because if we can't get our stuff together, we're bringing down a whole bunch of other people. So that's really what we ended up doing. And so we broke it out by that. And then we broke it out by within a family. I think the next one we did was religion. Trust me, that one blew up like easily.
Not bad.
And we did one on the Boy Scouts and the U.S. gymnastic team. Again, the same type of concept.
Yeah.
And now we're launching one on the healthcare consequences of sexual violence. And we're doing it by age groups. Because there's times in which you can intervene, and what happens if you do intervene? What could you possibly do? So we just launched one, and it's doing very well on prenatal to 18, and then I'll launch the second part of that, which will be on women from age 19 to 35, and then from 36 to the end of life. What ends up happening. So, I think, I have to be honest, I think they're very good because it looks at how, on your podcast, they remain silent for all those years. And a lot of us, especially women of color, we are constantly told we're never to talk about what happened to us. So we, even going to the doctors, we don't tell our doctors what happened to us. We don't talk about this issue at all. Yeah. And so even when we need to get doctor's care, we don't bring it up. And then there's delay of care, there's healthcare disparities. You start naming all the stuff. And this is one of the things, if we could have gotten into the forefront of it earlier, or if we trained doctors how to talk to us about it, what a difference it could possibly make. Right. That's what they're doing here.
Well,
So,
I thought
so
it was
that's
really
what we're doing.
interesting, your story about your back was hurting, and you never were able to tell the doctor how your
Hell
hurt until you were 70?
Yeah. There's no freaking way. Number one, I didn't know that. So, to be clear, I didn't know this doctor. He was recommended to me.
Uh-huh.
And how do you tell a doctor that you go in and you look like this upper middle class chick? You know, educated, the whole freaking 9 yards. And he says, how did you know? She's this old hairline fracture. How do you know? Well, what am I going to say? My father beat the shit out of me and he kicked me and, I've had this injury for all these years as a result of it. Now that I got old, I still got it. I don't know him. I don't know how he's going to respond to me. And I think that's the part of the lack of training on doctors' part, medical staff. They don't know how to respond when someone says this to them. They don't know what to say. They'll say, oh, I'm sorry. I don't need your freaking pity, and I don't want your pity while you're trying to treat me, and I don't want you to look at me differently. So, no, you don't talk. And that, to me, is where one of the crimes is of this disease. Is, again, it comes back to a shame of something that happened to me that I did not cause, and it's still impacting me.
What made you decide to finally tell your doctor what happened?
I switched doctors, and I went back to my primary care doctor. I talked to her, and she knew who he was, and she had checked him. I did not. I didn't have the balls to do it. And I have to be honest, after I knew that she had talked to him, I still haven't made another appointment.
Oh, goodness.
The shame, it comes down to we never lose the shame of being violated.
Yeah, no, that's a big part of it for sure. Talk a little bit about your life before the podcast. All 72 years of it. You worked in an advocating kind of capacity.
I was always an advocator, but never told my story. But my background is as an economist. I was a water resources economist. Talk about boring-ass job.
Well, you're good with numbers. You use a lot of statistics in your podcast.
Well, that's what I know. And I also know that having people relate to numbers makes much more sense. So, like when we're looking at the 3.3 million women in this U.S. between 18 and 44 was sexually violated. Their first sexual encounter was as a result of some form of rape or coercion. That 3.3 sounds big, but when you say it's larger than the entire population of the city of Chicago, which is the third largest city in the country, the numbers then magnify. And I learned that as an economist, so that whatever numbers that you're looking at, I remember that in your podcast you mentioned, I think it's either every 73 seconds of somebody in the U.S. has been violated. Do that number by 70, whatever number of seconds in a year. And I think that number turns out to be like 361,000 people. And compare that 360 or whatever that number is to some city that people could recognize. People understand that number at that point. Because other than that, it's just a number.
I guess that would be about twice the size of the town that I live in, and how many people are sexually assaulted per year. So it's about twice the size of the city of Springfield. So
that's a perfect example of it. And then after that, a minimum of 12 to 13% will be suicidal, and at least 80% of them will have some form of PTSD. So how the hell do you function as a city? So you use it. I'm an economist, so you use your numbers to help people understand what those numbers mean. So I did water resources for years, 80 years. I owned my own business. And then as time went on, I just got more and more bored doing that. And I was doing advocacy. So I was involved in developing some of the first domestic violence programs in San Francisco Bay Area. And then I moved into child abuse. They'll never tell my story. Then did foster care. Did never tell my story. I never told anybody.
Wow.
At all. Because I didn't want anybody to look at me different. I was on the Planned Parenthood board, and we were a big federation, and these typical white, offense to your audience, chicks that live in Napa and Sonoma and St. Helena Hills, with big vineyards and rich-ass husbands, they were going on and about those poor, unwanted children. I mean, it was just the typical California crazy liberal, you wanted a gag conversation. And they were going on about how once you're a teenager, you have a child, you can never recover. I'm sitting there, and I said, that's bullshit. Cause guess what? I was an unwanted child. It was like, oh shit. And I said, what you guys doing are writing it all off. And this is just, and so we had a lot of conversations, but I just set up the condescending attitude of it. But I never told anyone. It was just too painful for me to tell.
When did you finally tell everybody? When did this story finally come out to the world?
Maybe I should do the podcast.
Really?
I told some people off and on, but really to be able to talk about it, no. Doing the podcast was the first time I did it. And it was difficult to do, but I did it. And I made the decision about 2 years ago I was going to do it. And it took me damn near a year to find the courage to really do it.
Me too. Same thing. I sat on my podcast for a year. I knew it was worthy of getting out in the world and that we needed to talk about it, but I was scared, just like you.
Yeah. One of the things that I've been very good at is doing things and working in the background. I don't like to be seen. And doing a podcast means I have to be seen. And I don't like being seen at all. That's really the challenges of doing these things for me. I don't like to be
vulnerable, for sure.
It makes me extremely vulnerable. And I'm also at 72. I really don't take a lot of BS anymore. So there's that issue too.
I can tell.
And I have like no problem popping off and going, you can go do whatever the hell you want, lady. I don't really give a rat's ass. I think that it's my age. I think that I've lived enough, and I am not going to be intimidated anymore. And more importantly, I recognize I can no longer allow my father to win. And it's one of the things that I think that we have to talk about when you're doing these podcasts. We can't continue allowing what happened to us. In my case, it started when I was 14, so it was 58 years ago. It drives me at this point. I can't allow it anymore.
It's kind of like terrorism. We don't want the terrorists to win.
That's really what we've done. I mean, because you think about it, we have been terrorized by some form of a dictator. That's why I go back to the hand put in charge. My father, he in his own little mind was Hitler. But he didn't have 6 million Jews to destroy. He didn't have whole countries to take over. He just had me,
Yeah.
You live under a reign of terror. And I don't think anybody, unless you've been victimized, unless we're doing these podcasts and really talk about that level of fear that we've experienced, I don't think anybody understands it. We all understand it.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality is that reign of terror that we lived under as children. And most of us, you know, if we were victimized by a family member, we lived in their household. You know, my father fed me and clothed me and housed me. He did all of those things. And I never had a chance to forget that bastard did those things. He constantly reminded me. And then if you add to the fact that you are now betrayed, and that's the one thing that I've learned about this, we have been betrayed by family members. Because those people who should have stepped in and protected us chose not to. So you combine fear and betrayal, we're in deep trouble.
Yeah. One of the reasons I really wanted to, well, I want to bring attention to your podcast, but I need more voices on my show to represent minorities, because I know it's hard enough as a white girl to get the courage to go up and talk to the police and assume that they're just not going to help me. But
we know they're not going to help us.
What it's like for black people.
Let me put it as politely as kid. That whole bullshit, you know, you should talk to someone, you should talk to the police. Give me a break. My father was a correctional officer, so I grew up around police. I understand police. Don't get me wrong. But one of the things that I know as an adult, and I'm like 72, so I've lived through the civil rights movement. My first time I realized black folks could die was Emmett Till, and that was 1955, 56. I have no faith that if I were to tell the police this happened to me, they would release me. I have no, and one of the things, if I lived in a community with and I did, where everybody knew my family, and the police showed up about this, no one would believe me, and the police would not believe me.
Yeah.
You don't trust the police. When you talk about Black Lives Matter, one of the things that we're talking about in our podcast, if you want to end systemic racism, start with this crime. Let's not worry about the guys, not worry about blacks who are dying from the police. Every day, some black kid or some kid of color is being destroyed by sexual violence. And nobody's talking to that kid. No one talks to us. And I think the best example of it was I was doing some volunteer work at a juvenile facility in the Bay Area. And they're all young boys, so we couldn't ask them if we're sexually violent because, but we talked all around it. And this little kid said to me, well, Miss Teresa, well, what if I like this? So I'm thinking, holy shit, I don't know what's going on in this conversation. So he came back, I mean, you know, I don't know what to say. I wasn't that experienced in doing this at that point. And the next week I came back, and this kid looked like a malnourished, you know, sparrow. I mean, he was a little thin dude. But he had himself all huffy-puffy, just like, and he said to me, have you seen that damn commercial? Have you seen it where if you send in $19, you get a goddamn T-shirt to save you some? He's a effing dog. I feel like no clue what this kid's talking to me about. He's raging about this. And then I realized it was the AFEC's commercial that you could save a dog, you know, the starving dogs in the cages for $19. And Sarah McLaughlin is singing her singing that song. And he said, hey, nobody saving my black ass like holy. All of the same. And that to me is where the difference is. We know that somebody else might get help. We don't get help. We are not going to go see counselors because that's not who we are. We are trained from the very youngest of ages to never trust the police. Do not talk about this that happens. Therefore, you don't tell doctors. You add every form of racism on top of this. This is what's killing us.
Well, how do you
look at
this to change?
I think I don't know. I don't know. But one of the things that I'm now going to do, now that I figured out, we got followers, I'm going to see if I can get on some of the well-known Black podcasts. I'm going to see if I can get on some of the top radio shows and just have a discussion. I'm going to work my ass off to bring it to the forefront. Now that I know that we have an audience, I can do that. And now that I know that we're in a number of countries, including African countries, we can have this conversation. But I had to build to the point where I now could go in and say, this is what I know. Would you like to have this conversation? And come armed with stats.
Yeah.
And say, if you look at our correctional system, see how that works. But one of the biggest things that we're doing when I'm talking about this healthcare is to look at correctional healthcare. Because there's so many, you're talking about the epidemic of pills in Springfield, Missouri. Look at the number, just look at the stats on the number of women that are being incarcerated. And think about the fact that their health care is something called correctional health care. And those women rotate in and out of the prison system or jail, correctional system. The worst form of friggin' out health care they can have is correctional health care. That correctional health care and how they have been able to handle their health will have a great deal of impact on their children and the rest of the community. So that's how we're beginning to look at it. Not about how great the podcast is, but I could bring you knowledge that you could be able to help. Maybe we can have a bigger conversation. So I'm going to try to enlist some people from the WNBA because they're really strong on women's issues and women's justice. So that's what I'm saying. I'm figuring out who I can make conversations.
I think that's obviously the first step is to talk about it. What do we do after that?
And so I think the other thing is, one of the things that we're trying, I'm going to see is be able to develop a peer group. People like you, Dee, and people that you have on your podcast, we have a hell of a lot of knowledge. The problem is that if I am a kid and I report this, then CPS jumps in, and the next thing the family is destroyed, and everybody hates you if they ever get back together. Because there's all of these programs are set up with mandatory reporting. Mandatory reporting says, I ain't talking to your ass today. There's no friggin' ass rate because the risks and the consequences are too high. But if we had individuals like you and I and other people that have gone through these experiences, and somehow we're able to have a conversation and we're able to bring these kids to programs that work, that will save that child. It will save that mom. If it's learning from us as those who have been victimized, and then we are able to engage with them, not to have this kid's whole life be disturbed at that point, because you're talking about the trauma of getting into the foster care system. So you don't want to get a kid in there. But somewhere along the line in this training that we have a group of people that could come in and say, let me have a conversation with you, little boy or little girl. Let me talk about the fact that although you've been hearing that you're a victim and that your ass is doomed, the reality is I'm standing here right now. It happened to me, and you too, if we work together, can have a better life. It ain't gonna be easy, but baby girl, you're gonna be all right. But somebody in between the mandatory reporter, because by law, as a mandatory reporter, they got to turn that kid in. Every kid I know is terrified of that. That is the fear that they have. I mean, they know what the foster care system is. Nobody in their right mind wants to go into that. You think about doctors are mandatory reported, any medical people, social workers, but they're all mandatory reported. So how does that help the kid who's already terrified?
That is an important part of the process in getting help for people, is making sure when that reporting happens, that it happens in the right way. Whatever that is, it has to happen in the right way.
And that person needs to look like them.
Okay.
They need to, that person who's the peer group person needs to come from a similar background. And the reason for that is they can then put their arm around that kid. Trust me, the little huffy puffy dude kid who looked like a freaking sparrow, the hungry sparrow, he and I turned out to have a great relationship. And I knew what his problems were, but he also knew I would hold his confidence. And I would never tell any of the other boys what happened to him. And I would not talk to anybody else about what happened to him. But that, he could talk to me. And he told me things that I never shared with people. And it was just the ability for him to have someone to talk to, I think helped him a great deal. And I think that that's what we need. Yeah, that's what we need. We need to be able to have someone talk to us and say, that you're going to be all right. And it would be bad if that person had used drugs, had fallen on their ass several times, and they finally are making it. Because there's no straight line in this. There's no straight line of recovery. And trust me, one of the things I just said in the podcast of mine, I assume that we don't fall on your ass, but most of us got enough ass we can get back up, okay? It ain't going to hurt us. We got enough back ass, so we'll be okay. And I think people need to know that when you fall, it's not the end of the world. Most programs have an A through B through C, program. This is each step you need to make. Well, shit, you're not going to make it. You're going to fall on your ass. But the question is, how can you get back up? That really is the question that I think that those of us who have been victimized can say, yeah, I've fallen on my ass a number of times. Like the young woman who talked to I listened to your podcast. She threw hell after being raped, and she didn't want to go back to the police. What happened to her, she'd already experienced bad enough. She was having trouble with her family, but she found a way, eventually, to get back up. She is an example of what kids need to hear. That your podcast is directly for kids and other women who are like her. There's a way.
Yeah, the stories that we tell are so important, obviously, but if you keep hearing again and again and again how the police are going to mistreat you and they're going to screw up and your case is going to get dropped, why would anyone ever freaking know about the police? It's the police.
Why in the hell would you?
Actual police don't want to help you. I am positive that. There are good people in this world who want to help.
After the fact that you've gone for 5 hours going through a rape kit, test.
Yeah.
And then they figuring out lose your rape kit.
Yeah.
Why am I going to talk to you? You just don't.
It makes it very
That's
difficult
really where it
because
comes
of the
from.
precedents that have been set up. So we need to make new precedents. We need to make new stories. We need to find out the good things that have come out of it. We're stronger people. We can help others. We can use our pain to turn it around, but maybe also do something to the perpetrators. We need to make them not want to do it somehow.
One of the things that I think that we need to do is have conversations with boys.
Mm-hmm.
I have 2 sons. I have constantly told my sons, most things are like, Mom's always there for you. Even if you commit a murder, Mom's there. I ain't going to be pleased, but Mom will be there.
Mm-hmm.
You harm a woman or a girl, I don't know your ass. I will help bury your ass in a jail cell. Don't call me. And they heard that probably by the age of 9 and 10 years old. It is something that was drilled into them. I drilled it into my male cousins who are boys. I drilled it into everybody. I stopped 3 generations of sexual violence by myself and my family by having deep conversations with young people in the family. This shit happened to me. If something happens to you, you're to tell me. And I was and mind you, I'm maybe on a good day 5'4". I'm the smallest one in my family. And I said, but I put in a big bluff. I will take anybody's ass out. You are not going to allow this to happen. A couple of things were attempted. My cousins told me, and I went over and had a come to Jesus conversation, and it was ended. But what ended up happening is each of us, and especially as moms, and I'm saying of boys, everybody talks about protecting their girls. Our boys need to know this shit's not acceptable. My younger son was a jock, and he was telling me there's a story where a young girl went to a football team celebration for boys team, and she got raped. And he was telling me about it, and I said, "Can you imagine this shit happening?" He goes, "No, Mom, I know. I mean, it's so exactly. Just remember that." But the idea, and I put it into their minds early on, the idea of you harming a woman at any set of circumstances, or a girl at any set of circumstances, is beyond approach. And I think that we talk about saving our daughters. We need to talk about instilling into our sons. There's all my uses of clause.
And the perpetrator is one half of this conversation. Start to call out people that think are rapists and check on them.
I'll give you an example. I was at a big powwow, Native American powwow in San Francisco. And, you know, the Native Americans and indigenous people have a real problem with murder and missing women. So at this huge powwow of 500-600 people, apparently some sexual predator, someone recognized him. Do you know these people called his ass out on a microphone at this powwow? They called his ass out and said, "Your ass needs to leave."
Oh, that's
and
fair.
Apparently he acted like he didn't know what they were talking about. They have to be called out. And the other thing is, look at the numbers of people who are sexual predators who are prosecuted. They're very, very few.
Yeah.
They're very, very few. There are 737,000 plus sexual predators. If you really want to work with us on some things, let's work with some numbers that we're putting numbers out so it registers to people. How the hell is this possible? How is it possible that at one point 31 states, maybe down to 11, that if you rape a young girl and you impregnate her, and as long as you're not convicted of first-degree rape, guess what? You have parental rights. No, asshole, you should not have parental rights. But they do. And those are the things that when you talk about this violence, nobody ever really comes out and talks about. It's all the other stuff.
Yeah.
And our judges that blame the young girl, well, perhaps she shouldn't have been in that situation, or what dress did she have on. Screw all that mentality. But that's the mentality that's out there against us.
It was when you were 70, maybe, that you decided to start telling the doctor about what happened to you?
Yeah.
And that was about 2 years ago. That's when the Supreme Court Kavanaugh thing, I think, was coming out. So that was during the Me Too. So it inspired you as well. It inspired so many women.
I think it inspired a lot of us. And I think that we're able to talk. But one of the things that I as a black woman, I look at the U2 movement, I don't see a lot of us in it. And I don't see a lot of the U2 movement talking about what happened to us sexually being violated. I mean, it really, to me, is a lot of times talking about, and I may be wrong, and it's just my prejudices, about, harassment on the job. Now, long before getting a second-ass job, I may have been sexually violated as a kid. I want to hear more of that. That's really what I'd like to be able. But it did inspire me to say, I could talk about this. It did do that. Yeah. But I also knew that this part, I don't know a woman who has not been sexually harassed on a job site. Come on. It happens to us. It's wrong. The real concern of mine is all of us who have never talked to about this. I mean, one of the things that I'm trying to put out as a survey and trying to figure out how to do it is ask, do you know anybody who's ever been sexually violated?
Yeah. It's the non-reported rapes that we don't know about. Reported rape, we can see how that works out. You don't have much of a good chance of getting justice, but, maybe you're crying and maybe what you've done will take another rapist off the street. It's the unreported rape. All of us who are terrified to tell our stories and ashamed of what it's done to us, we've got to find out more about that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what your podcast of mine could possibly do, is that, not calling people out, but saying, did it happen? And how did you handle them? What can you do to be able to find a way to resolve them? But, it's all of us who have never talked about it.
Well, we're talking about it now.
In next week's episode of Rape the Podcast, I talk with a young victim that reminded me of me.
It happened to me. I was so young when it happened, and it is a part of me, and it still affects me every day. So I don't understand how I can just let it go.
The Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, otherwise known as RAINN.org, operates the National Sexual Assault Hotline and the Department of Defense Safe Helpline. RAINN provides domestic violence therapy for perhaps every kind of sexual abuse and assaults out there. They also assist those who have been the victims of prison assault, military assault, elder abuse, and abuse at the hands of physicians, just to name a few. If you need help for yourself or help for someone you know, call 1-800-656-HOPE or visit rain.org. And any donation you can make to help RAINN would be a very satisfying way to make yourself feel better. Thank you for joining me. I'm Julie Ballou, and this is Rape the Podcast.